Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to, I need to get this right, the London Archives. So, if any of you are not familiar, we've recently changed our name. So for many years, the best part of 3 decades, we were London Metropolitan Archives, and as of this month, we are now the London Archives. If you're here in the building, you would have perhaps noticed a few changes, some paint here and there, a bit of a moving the furniture. That's okay, that's just me and echo, and a bit of a moving of the furniture, but I hope largely things will be the same, only better. So the core service will remain the same, and actually there'll be more events such as this going on as well. So hopefully start of an invigorating and new chapter in the history of this place. A few bits of more prosaic housekeeping I need to make as well at this point. The first is to say that this is a hybrid event, hence the equipment at the front here. So as well as welcoming people here in the room this afternoon, a big welcome to those of you who are joining us at home as well via YouTube. For the benefit of the people in the building, I need to say that we're not expecting the fire alarm to go off this afternoon. So should the fire alarm go off, we need to leave the building, which we can do by going out the double doors at the back of the room, down the main set of stairs, and then out through the main entrance, and we'll just wait till we're given the all clear to get back into the building. And then for the benefit of the people watching at home, my colleague Rachel, hi Rachel, is very kindly managing the chat for you there. So if you have any questions or comments as the talk progresses, please feel free to pop them in the chat, and we'll come to them at the end. We'll switch between hybrid, in the room and the online portion for the questions. And talking of questions, some of you will have heard this disclaimer before. Every so often I like to make this little disclaimer, and today feels like one of those days, which is to say that I'm not an expert on what we're talking about today. So my job title, very good job title, is I'm Engagement and Learning Officer. And what that means in practice, it's my job to know sort of a little bit about a lot of things in the collection. It's my job to put these things together that will hopefully be kind of interesting and informative based on what we've got going on in the archive. And as many of you will be aware, we've currently got an exhibition, Lost Victorian City, London Disappeared. Get that the right way round. So we're talking all things Victorian, and I thought therefore it would be a nice occasion to delve into the world of Victorian vices. But fools rush in where angels fear to tread. It's actually quite a kind of a complex and nuanced topic. The Victorians is a long time period, and it turns out we have quite a lot of interesting stuff here at the archive to talk about. So I've been a bit of a magpie for the talk this afternoon, and kind of delved into various collections that we have, picking out some interesting trinkets for your appreciation and information. But if I've got anything wrong, I'm not sort of an expert, as I say, not an expert in the collections that we're talking about. I'm very happy to be corrected by that in the question portion at the end. So with that caveat, with that disclaimer being said, we'll make a start with the main presentation. So on the screen here, and are you okay to keep the slides changing, Rachel? Thank you. On the screen here, we have a piano, an illustration from the Illustrated London News. And it seems an appropriate place to start the presentation this afternoon, because I'm sure many of you will have heard that the Victorians used to cover up their piano legs with tablecloths or other sort of bits of embroidery, lest people be embarrassed, lest it be too forward, too suggestive in some way. Well, some people might be surprised to hear, but I think an erudite, historically minded crowd such as yourself will probably not be too surprised to hear that that is a myth. That was a myth that was actually started in Victorian times themselves, and somewhat ironically, it was used by sort of British Victorians to sort of make fun of their Victorian colleagues across the Atlantic, because this idea of covering up table legs and other furniture legs started as a way for the English to sort of mock the puritanical ideals of Americans. But it's one of those stories that grows in the telling. So we first hear this talking about in 1843 that the Americans are so prudently modest that they furnished their pianos with muslin trousers, because in that virtuous country, bare legs are held to be unbecoming, even in thoughtless pianos. But the joke in many ways is now on us, because by 1860, the French were now telling this story about the English. And it's become one of those kind of historical myths that's hard to disprove. That we all know that if we know something about the Victorians, we know they were prudish and that they covered up their piano legs. Now, in recent years, that view, as you might expect, has come under sort of quite intense historical criticism, and I was happy to find, when researching this talk, an article in History Today saying, with the title of "How did the Victorians become a reference point for joyless prudery?" Four historians were consulted their opinion on this topic, and the conclusion of the article was that it was unjustified. Perhaps there was the odd hint here or there, but really this was an unfair reputation. I'm not sure, and I agree, it's a bit of an audacious thing to say with my earlier comment about not being an expert, but from what we're going to present today, I think we can say that perhaps they weren't joyless prudes, but the idea that there wasn't something going on of interest, something going on that's interesting and worth comment, is an oversimplification in and of itself. So today we're going to look at three Victorian vices: sex, drinking and gambling, and we're going to have a bit of a delve into this sort of curious, you might say paradoxical, you might even just say hypocritical, certainly complex world of Victorian vices. And we're going to start with that. That's not what I need to do. We're going to start. There we go. We're going to start with the quintessential Victorian herself. We're going to start with Queen Victoria, because right from the start of her reign in June 1837, Queen Victoria defined her reign in terms of virtue and vice. In June of that year, she issued a proclamation against vice and for the encouragement of piety and virtue. And the reading of this proclamation became a frequent occurrence in civic, public, and even religious occasions, a kind of a symbol of what her people should aspire to. As in any sort of historical phenomena, we can sort of find various explanations for that, but one of the most pressing, I think, is a clear intent to separate herself and her reign and even her people from the reputation for kind of immodesty and excess of her Georgian forebears. A point nicely summarised in this satire that we can see on the screen here. This is George IV. Depicted as sort of larger than life drinking, enjoying, and this is at his wife's funeral. The satire being partly look how sad he is, famously terrible relationship with his queen, but also we do get that sense of excess from the top. And this was something, as I say, that Victoria was keen to distance herself from, not least for practical purposes, as that the excesses and, dare I say, even the incompetences of the previous reign had led to a real crisis in monarchy in this country. This was a time where monarchs were being deposed, being overthrown, sometimes in quite grisly ways. So there was a sense that the reputation of the monarchy had to be restored, and one way to do that was through the promotion of virtue and a sort of a campaign against vice. Well, so far so good, but we might just say, that's just something from the top. We all make public statements are made, but really there isn't anything too interesting going on. Well, then, if that's the case, my next bit of evidence for the prosecution to say there is something interesting going on with Victorians and their vices is this man. This is William Ewart Gladstone, who was a four-time Prime Minister during the Victorian reign, first in 1868 with his final tenure in office, finishing in 1894. And he, again, is probably one of those things you don't need to know very much about Victorian history to know something about this man. So this is the Prime Minister that was committed to a Christian morality, committed to Christian charity, but it manifested itself in a way that's slightly striking, at least we could say, to a modern eye. So from 1840, Gladstone began the work of, as he put it, rescuing and rehabilitating London prostitutes. And in 1848, he founded the Church Penitentiary Association for the reclamation of fallen women. Now, being involved in philanthropy, being involved in charitable causes, particularly those aligned with the prevailing morality of the day, was in no way unusual for a man of Gladstone's status. But what was more unusual is, as one man put it, the way that he stalked the streets of central London with an almost reckless abandon trying to find actually finding individual prostitutes and sort of counselling them, trying to get them back on their feet, a kind of a one-to-one intervention. As you might imagine, claims of impropriety did follow the man round at this point. They were never never upheld, and indeed Gladstone is one of the rare cases of having of his descendants bringing a libel action against his detractors, when in the 1920s a biographer claimed that he employed the services of these women, and as I say was taken to court and lost, and that decision went against him. But again, there is something. It is not so simple. We know from the editors of Gladstone's diaries know that after that he records the meeting with these women in his diaries, and afterwards a curious mark is found in his diaries, which has later been interpreted as a whip. And the sense is that after these meetings, Gladstone involves in sort of some form of self-flagellation, and the explanation being that the interaction with these prostitutes was a way to sort of test his will. He wanted to get very close to temptation and then not succumb, and in doing so, he could show his moral character. It could show the strength of his moral character. So again, it might not be that the Victorians. Did indeed cover up their table legs, but I think we can definitely say there is something going on. There is something interesting. There is interesting there, and of course the reality is always going to be far more interesting and complex than any kind of historical caricature. And what I think we have at the heart of that reputation for modesty is this sense of sort of polite dinner table conversation. That's what springs to my mind. This idea that things are being sort of said in quite a sort of starched, literally buttoned up environment, and that there's a real sense of the word that was used to a real desire to maintain a respectability, particularly in the home. And one of the biggest threats to respectability, as it was known, was some kind of sexual practice outside of this fairly restrictive morality of the day. But we can tell, we have a lot of evidence that a lot of this was happening from some the bare facts that find their way into the archive. And we know that a lot of this this behaviour that went against the kind of the virtue of the day that we can term vices, centred around servants and domestic servants, particularly when we're talking in terms of legitimacy or illegitimate children. Before we look at some of the archival sources that we hold here, I just want to give a little bit of sort of context to Victorian ideas of gender and sexuality, because they'll inform well in the next discussion that we have. So, one of the key figures that we have in referring to Victorian both moral and medical attitudes to sex is Dr. William Acton, and we can see the frontispiece of one of his famous works on the screen here, Prostitution: Its Moral, Social and Sanitary Aspects. And we'll come to this in a moment. But I actually want to draw your attention to the other side of the page, the works by the same author, a practical treatise on the disease of the urinary and generative organs in both sexes, and the functions and disorders of the reproductive organs. Because it's in these works that Acton makes the claim. Let me just get it right exactly. That Acton makes the claim that the majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. And this idea that women were sexless creatures that had no desires of their own, and that needed to be maintained in a sort of a sense of sort of moral ignorance about such matters, was a kind of a key cornerstone of what we call respectable Victorian morality. And alongside that, there was a notion that men, in contrast with women, were creatures who had to constantly fight their baser instincts, that they were kind of constantly bedeviled with sort of deep primal sexual and other urges, and it was only through kind of great self-control that they needed to keep these at bay, and that was for the sort of the protection of those around them, and indeed for their own self-protection as well, because in sort of spending their energies, sexual or otherwise, they would deplete themselves, and in so doing, be unable to take part in sort of bettering activities for themselves and for society at the whole. And it was this idea that was at the heart of sort of Victorian treatise against sort of masturbation. The idea being that men, and it was men that were being referred to, would sort of dispense their energies in this sort of idle and often immoral pursuit. So a lot of those ideas that we sort of have come to define the Victorians' ideas, certainly in the popular imagination, can be traced back to Acton. But there are some sort of unusual kind of corollaries that come from his work, and in particular this work on prostitution. So we can say, I think, quite clearly this is a sort of a moralistic time, but there's an element of, and I use the word somewhat advisedly, a sort of practicality here as well, a sense of a necessary evil. And that indeed is how Acton describes in prostitution. The idea being that if men have these base urges that need sort of letting out from time to time, and women don't, the only way for the sanctity of marriage and respectable behaviour is for men to visit prostitutes from time to time. And following this, we see a real kind of moral and medical concern over prostitution in the capital, and it's the capital that we'll refer to today. So we have wildly varying estimates of the number of prostitutes that are working in London at this time, from as high as 200,000 to sort of the low tens of thousands. I think we can take that higher figure with a pinch of salt, because it seems like, and this sounds like I'm making a bad taste joke, and I'm really not, it seems like the way that the assessment criteria was, well, they look like one, or they're behaving in ways outside of the norm, unchaperoned, dressing in a certain way, all those sorts of things. So it was customary on the dirty streets of London. We've all seen Victorian skirts. It was customary for women to lift their skirts to not get them muddy. But if they were lifted too high, that was a sign of that this was a sex worker. And obviously, quite what too high means is very much up for interpretation. So I hope we're starting to build this picture of a society that is interested in sort of pleasures of the flesh, but in quite a contradictory way. And that picture builds with another work of William Acton, a publication from 1859 for the Royal Statistical Society of London, and this is credited as being the first sort of systematic or statistical survey of illegitimacy. And here again, I'm interested not so much in Acton's views, which were quite simply that illegitimacy was a bad thing, that women were much better married to bring up children, and that sort of wastrel fathers needed to be coerced sort of legally or financially in order to bring up to assist with the childcare. There's obviously some truth in that. There's some untruth in that as well. There's a lot of taking away of people's agency, but that's not necessarily our concern. What is interesting about this work, it's actually a very useful way in to some of the collections that we hold here at the archive, and it brings an interesting level of detail to what we mean, to the sorts of things that people were sort of doing on a daily basis. So this is the Register of Births in the workhouse of St George the Martyr, Southwark, part of the Southwark Board of Guardians collection that we have here. So this is, as the name suggests, children who were born in the workhouse, and we get a sense of the interest in morality, and a sense of what's going on with this column here. So we have column date of birth, and that's date of birth of the child, whether male or female, name of parents, whether legitimate or illegitimate, when baptised, in what name baptised, and then a column for remarks on the top. And I draw your attention to the legitimate column. So we have many on this occasion, and I didn't select it quite at random, but nor did I sort of page through to find the best one to make my case either, if that makes sense. We can see quite a few illegitimate children, to use their language. And interestingly as well, quite a lot of father unknown as well. And the reason I bring this up is to give just more nuance to this picture. And the same thing we can say, actually we'll come to that one in a second, I think. Sorry, Rachel, don't know to change just yet, we'll come to that one in a second. So what we can see here then is it's not as simple as the caricature of Victorian morality of people sort of innocent and ignorant of sexual matters is not true. What we find in reality is there are sort of what's the word? So norms and there's norms and expectations around courtship, which can sort of be boiled down to people will have sex outside of marriage. Young people will have sex outside of marriage. It is a part of courtship, but it's done often cautiously. It's done as part of a sort of some kind of longer term relationship, and with the expectation that if the woman becomes pregnant, then the marriage will ensue. And actually quite a lot of the kind of the policing, both sort of literal and sort of moral, is around the sort of sense of a broken promise. So marriage was seen as acceptable at any point, or even slightly after pregnancy. That was seen as something that would happen. And even after childbirth was in no way uncommon. So this is a register from a little later, actually, from the 1870s, from Queen Charlotte Maternity Hospital, which was one of the main hospitals, which was one of the prime hospitals for women who couldn't afford to give birth anywhere else. And again, we have a name column, a residence column, age, and notice the fairly kind of consistent ages there. Late teens and 20s, with a few exceptions there, and then a column for married and single, and there's a lot of single women here in this table. And the point I really want to make here is that we know from other research that around 70% of these women were employed in domestic service, and this is a figure greater than their representation in the general population. So it was the most common form of employment for women, certainly in the early Victorian period, but it's represented over that. And this gives us a sense of, again, it's just to kind of nuance that picture. We have a vision of a Victorian dinner table with, again, erroneous perhaps, of table legs being covered up and the like, meat being described as sort of dark or light, not breast or thigh, those sorts of things. But elsewhere, the picture is far more complicated. And if you are interested in the nuance of those things, the collection I really recommend, that I'm not going to talk about today, is the Foundling Hospital collection. So, and I'm happy to say from October this year, a lot of that will be digitised and available remotely. Previously, it's been available here. So the London Archives looks after it on behalf of Quorum. And from October this year, many of their records will become available, including the petition letters. So the petition letters, I think, are one of the most special things we look after here in a building full of special things. The petition letters are, as the name suggests, they're the women making their case to have their child entered into the Foundling Hospital, so the hospital can take care of them, and then because the woman can't. And I think these are one of the best records we have of the reality or a reality behind sort of sexual relations in this domestic setting. The predominance of these records are women in domestic service. So it's a very important collection, but it's a very nuanced and tricky collection to work with as well, because there are undeniably many cases of rape and sexual assault and sort of coercion in those petition letters. And that's undeniable, but there's also a sense of some of the women knowing what the people need to hear, fitting their story to the moral standards of the admissions, and taking their agency. And that's why I made this not to actually bring up any particular ones, because it would feel very inappropriate for me to kind of cast any kind of doubt or aspersion on any individual testimony. But the idea that there's not some kind of nuance and agency there equally doesn't quite sit right with me either. So we've talked a lot about how sort of Victorian, how these vices might appeal in a domestic setting. And I've talked actually quite a lot longer than I expect. I was worried I was going to run out of things to say, and I've done the exact opposite. So I need to be a little bit to the point. Otherwise, we're going to miss out on the drinking and the gambling. And I promised you all three, and I don't want anyone demanding their money back. So we'll get to drinking rapidly via a short diversion into Victorian pornography. So the theme of our exhibition, lost Victorian London. And one of the themes, of course, with that is sort of streets and places that have been have disappeared, have been swept away by progress in inverted commas. And this is a page from the famous the Booth map. So they don't need to detain us today, but just for completeness' sake, the colours are an indication of the wealth of the people that live in the buildings. This is the Strand, sort of main thoroughfare in London for those not familiar, and we might just be able to make out this is Holywell Street. And this just here above the Strand. This is Holywell Street, and Holywell Street was famous for its booksellers. It was famous for its bookselling, but also it was a place. Here we can see it on the screen in 1901. You can see Book Depot in the picture on the left-hand side, but it was also famous as a place where if you were after some sort of racy material, where you would go. And one of the most famous infamous of the Victorian pornographers was a man called William Dugdale, one of William Dugdale's shops was at 37 Holywell Street in this alley. So you can see here 36 with this rather charming full moon sign, purportedly the oldest shop sign still in existence in the Museum of London. And down this alley was one of Dugdale's shops. We'll skip by that one. So Dugdale was a printer of very loose sort of loose and lax standards, as well as his trade in sort of pornographic materials. We will have our own opinion about the morality of that. He also engaged in some fairly unscrupulous business practices. So he was famous for sort of selling old books as new books as old books, taking other people's work and just changing the title, taking a long book, splitting up into 3 books to make more money off it. All kinds of sort of shady business practices. But this was also the place where if you wanted something illicit, if you wanted something obscene, as it was described in at the time, where you would go, one of several such places on Holywell Street. And what we have on the screen here is a record of an undercover policeman going to buy, as a sting operation, going to buy something from the shop. And this is part of a criminal case, one of many criminal cases that was brought against William Dugdale. It's quite hard to read, so I have transcribed it. I've done my best at the transcription. I'm not the world's best transcriber, and the text is a bit confusing in place. So I've given this my best go, but do bear with me if there are any obvious mistakes. And perhaps rather than me reading the whole thing, I'll leave that on the screen for you to read here and at home, and just make a few points. So what we have is the police officer Charles Briscoe going in undercover, asking to buy something. He's aware of the nature of material that might be sold, because there is a picture there's a picture in the window, and he leaves the shop with a copy of that picture and a work entitled Gems for Gentlemen, for which he paid 3 pence. And so, as you might imagine, what these sellers would do is they'd put something in the window which would indicate what you could find inside. This could be often this would be kind of classical in nature, an allusion to Venus, perhaps, a kind of a piece of sort of Greek or Roman art with nudity involved, to kind of give a sort of a justifiable defence that actually it was about antiquity, about classics, about scholarship, not something more, as the language of the time would have had it, something more obscene. The ruse hasn't worked in this time, as we can hear. As we can deduce, he's been arrested and is eventually charged. So he spends William Dugdale spends several kind of times in prison. Just after this, he spends about 2 years in the Clerkenwell House of Detention, and he actually dies in prison 1868 as well. He'd been sentenced to hard labour, but actually died in prison before his sentence was carried out. And before we move on, I'm intrigued to know this sort of about this postscript, where we have the main sort of deposition here by the police constable, and then it just examined. There was a label over a fraction of the picture covering about the centre of it. So I have visions of the sort of the naughty picture in the window being covered up in some way, again as a part of sort of plausible deniability to get it. But that is conjecture on my part. Now, I decided not to because, frankly, with some of the research I was doing for this section, I'm still quite worried I'm going to get a call for HR because I foolishly did this on my work account. But if one is interested, one could find out what the content of Gems for Gentlemen was quite easily by looking at this work. So this is the Index Laborium Prohibitum, written under the pseudonym of Persamus Fraxi, but written by Henry Spencer Ashby. And I want to read you a quote by Matthew Green. Or do I have it? No, I don't have it. That's annoying. By Matthew Green, who I found lots of information from on a very interesting blog post on public domain review. So this is. It claims to be a bibliography of prohibited books, and the name itself is a reference to the Catholic Church's list of banned books. Curious and uncommon books are pornographic books in this case, and what Ashby has provided is sort of a précis and a summary of these books, but in sort of quite, shall we say, lavish detail. So in some cases you wouldn't need to read the book itself. This in some ways was a substitute for that book, as again a bit of a kind of a work around the various obscenity laws that would come to force by this time. And Holywell Street was a kind of a constant problem for Victorian authorities. Dugdale was arrested and died in prison, but no sooner was he arrested, someone else would take their place. And so by 1902, a fairly drastic solution was taken, which was to demolish it. Probably not solely for that reason. It was a way to alleviate the bottleneck around the Strand, a traffic black spot even then. But certainly the idea of improving the character of the neighbourhood would have come into considerations. And for those who know the area, it's the area around Aldwych today. After all that talk of sex in public, I could probably do with a stiff drink, but I'd have to be careful doing that in Victorian times, lest I fall foul of a vociferous temperance movement. So this is the first plate of 8 plates of a best-selling work of caricature by George Cruikshank. George Cruikshank was a satirist in his own right, an illustrator in his own right, but also famous for working extensively with Charles Dickens, illustrating many of his works. And over on the 8 plates that we'll see a small selection of, we will get a sense of some of the strong attitudes the Victorian temperance campaigners had about drinking and the ruin that it could bestow upon you. And I think I should say, as a point of context, I think it's easy from the sort of the point of the 21st century to be a bit sort of maybe dismissive over some of these concerns, and certainly there is again a moralism, and certainly there's a looking down upon the members of the working classes inherent in this. But alcohol did cause great problems at this time. A level of kind of binge drinking, a level of drinking that we would think of as beyond the pale today was fairly common, and there were genuine consequences in terms of people's sort of finances and domestic violence and things like that. So we have to be maybe a little bit careful about being too sort of snooty from the future on these things. And indeed, Cruikshank suffered some of these consequences personally. So he was a heavy drinker himself, and his father died. In his earlier years, he was a heavy drinker himself. By this point, when he wrote the bottle, he was drinking less, and by the time, and a few years after that, he became teetotal for the rest of his life. An expression itself coined by the temperance movement at this time. And Cruikshank's father, Isaac Cruikshank, died in a drinking contest. So we can see, obviously, that some of these issues hit quite close to home. This is, say, the first of 8. This is the first of 8 plates. We can see a respectable Victorian Victorian home. Modest in some ways, but certainly comfortable in others. It's not big, but it's got the objet d'art. It's got the furnishings. It's got the grandfather clock. There's food on the table. There's a sense of prosperity, of harmony. The kids playing, eating at their table as well. But it's a little bit cut off. So I'll say that at the bottom it says the bottle is brought out for the first time. The husband introduces his wife to take a drop, and it's this idea of just taking a drop over the series of many plates will lead the wife to a violent death at the hands of the husband, and the husband himself to become a patient in an asylum. Here we see him after that, and we go through a series of steps of their house being pawned, him becoming ever violent. And this was a hugely popular series at the time. It sold over 100,000 copies. Cruikshank was fated as a successor to William Hogarth. I personally don't think it's as good as Hogarth in its own ways. Technically, the drawing is very good. I don't think it has the kind of the charm or the richness of Hogarth, but that is just my opinion. And following the success of the bottle in 1847, he followed up with the Drunkard's Children in 1848. The culmination of which is the daughter of this family, who's drunk too much gin, worked as a prostitute, has committed self-murder, as described by Cruikshank, by throwing herself off this bridge. So a very strong but unsubtle message about the dangers of drinking. There were other concerns about drinking too, not always put so strongly. One in particular was that it was too profitable, that the working classes were spending too much of their money on drink, gin in particular, and that there was excessive profiteering. And this was the phenomenon of gin shops or gin palaces. These were places with really just stripped down to the basics of drinking, very quick service, no tables, standing up, service at a bar, which today we take for granted, but at the time was an innovation from the gin palaces. The idea being that it would get you as drunk as possible, as quickly as possible. And as you might expect, there was quite a lot of condemnation, quite a lot of criticism about the often sort of working class and even destitute customers of such establishments. A lot of it said if they spent, no wonder they're poor, they're spending their money on the gin shop, and then they're too drunk to work or too hungover to work. But other commentators, such as Dickens, sort of put the problem the other way round, that it was the poverty, the dirt, the difficulty of their existence that made drinking at the gin shop so attractive. So this was a kind of common feature of sort of working class drinking at this time. I tend to think there's often a case in these situations if it's one rule for me and another for thee. I've gone slightly outside our time period, this 1831. I hope that's okay, but this was just too much fun not to include. This is a satire, as I say, from 1831 on the satire on civic hospitality. This is one of the Lord Mayor's banquets. The various animals are the things that would have been consumed through the course of the meal, and are having a terrible nocturnal attack of heartburn, or even worse. We can see that the portly alderman is fending off the revenge of his dinner with champagne. With champagne bottles serving as pistols. The idea being to remind us, should we need any reminder, that obviously drinking was something that all classes did, often to excess, but not always, but often in the Victorian periods, as indeed other periods, it was often those at the lower members of society who were most criticised for it. And throughout the Victorian period, as indeed today, the pub was a sort of a focal point of communal life. So it was not just a place for drinking. So drinking was obviously something you would do there, busiest between sort of Friday to Monday in these time periods. But it's also a place where you go to socialise. It's also a place where you'd often conduct business. Some people, often workers, were paid in the pub, sometimes even paid in beer and hospitality itself. Speaking of hospitality, so on the right-hand side we have the George Inn, still remains in Southwark. This was a coaching inn. So coaching inns did wane by the end of the Victorian period, replaced by railway hotels. These are places where you would drink, you would eat, you would stay, but you would also kind of conduct business as well. So drinking was sort of very much was weaved into the fabric of Victorian life in a way it's not quite to the same extent. We might go out for a drink after work. We might celebrate things, work accomplishments sort of after work or at the weekends. But it was quite common sort of during the working day to have a drink to celebrate an accomplishment. And drinks like beer in particular, weak beer, wasn't seen as necessarily an intoxicant. It was seen as something nourishing, something that would give strength and stamina. So miners, for example, were known to report to drink sort of 8 to 24 pints of weak beer during a shift, which seems like a lot, but you can imagine if that's your standard fare and the kind of the heat and the exertion, that actually it's not such a terrible thing to be drinking. And just to finish off again, apologies for not quite getting the timing right. We now get the third of our three vices, that of gambling. So gambling again. In a similar pattern to what we've looked at before, there were strong connotations around sort of purity, around character, and concerns around people being sort of foolish with their money and their resources, and engaging in frivolous and sort of harmful pastimes when they should be doing more constructive things. So. Well, to start with the middle classes on this occasion, gambling. The most popular form of gambling among the middle class was horse racing. Was gambling on horse racing. So the middle classes were frequent visitors at Epsom and other horse racing meets, standing, congregating in the various grandstands. Men and women would bet alike, but often the bets. The women's bets were put on by the men, and in respect to its becoming increasingly popular pastime throughout the period, we see sort of more time in newspapers and other media being devoted to sort of reporting on horse racing, the reporting of odds and things like that. And by the 1870s, we see more sort of specialist betting officers appearing. Gambling, there was these forms of gambling in designated places on horse racing was legal, but other forms of gambling were illegal. So gambling houses were also popular with the Victorian middle classes, and those were illegal. We have records of at least 35 gambling houses in central London in the early Victorian period, but they are probably many more than that. And as I say, although they were illegal, in practice, enforcement was lax. This was in part due to police corruption. If you were the proprietor of a gambling house, you'd often have a kind of the local policeman on your books, a bribe counting as a business expense, but also because there was just real difficulties in sort of raiding and securing a conviction. Knowing what they were doing was was illegal. Gambling houses would have their doors and windows often reinforced with metal bars and barricades that would be locked shut whilst operating, necessitating the sort of the physical sort of breaking down of these barriers to enter the premises if the police were raiding them. And then a sort of a system of kind of codes and signals would allow kind of the evidence of illegality to be quickly hidden up. And some gambling houses even had sort of escape tunnels and basements and roofs as well. So it was quite a slick operation to be able to evade the law. And frankly, most of the time, it wasn't worth the trouble. And the enforcement really only took place sort of tokenistically every so often to appease the sort of section of society campaigning against gambling. So gambling houses were popular with the middle classes, but they're probably sort of more integral to upper class life, upper class gambling life, and they were known as hells. And we get a description of where that name comes from in this extract from John Timm's Curiosities of London, which was published in our copies from 1860, 1868, and it gives a nice contrast. I like this last this last section here, the handsome gas lamp and the green or red baize door at the end of the passage were conspicuous in the vicinity of St James and of St George Hanover Square. This idea that something, you know, quite delicate and quite genteel on the outside, there's something, you know, far more raucous going on the inside. Again, I think fits that point quite nicely of the kind of the contradictions of the Victorians around their vices and their virtues. So there were hells, but also gambling was an important part of sort of upper class club life. This is White's Club. Those are the most sort of famous and prestigious, and these days probably one of the more controversial of the London private members clubs. And playing games of chance, as well as card games and games like billiards as well, was just a common part of sort of upper class sociability at this time. It would take place in clubs, but also take place informally at country houses and the like. Aristocratic gambling was criticised. It was seen as sort of decadent, and it didn't really happen very often. Happened very rarely, in fact. The very few occasions where sort of aristocratic fortunes were lost was seized upon by the press and other campaigners as an example of how terrible the whole thing really was. As I say, but in actuality they were fairly rare, and occasionally these scandals would also sort of sweep up the royal family as well. So in the 1890s, the Prince of Wales was embroiled in a betting scandal. He at a horse racing meet, he was playing baccarat with some friends, but also some new acquaintances as well. He was serving as the banker, and two of the other players got into a dispute about the other cheating, and this was leaked to the press. It found its way into Parliament. A libel case ensued, and although the Prince of Wales himself wasn't accused of any wrongdoing on this case, it put a big question mark over the character of the sort of people he was hanging around with, associating himself with, and a more general kind of suspicion of what was known as sort of the fast set, the people around them, an idea that he probably wasn't living up to those sort of Victorian values that we started the presentation with, those proclamations by Queen Victoria. And indeed, some historians argue that pure exasperation at his son's behaviour sort of drove Albert, was one of the contributing factors to Albert's early death. So we've talked, and we've sort of gone sort of middle to upper, and now we'll finish the presentation with a quick look at working class gambling and attitudes there. And of course, when we get to the working class in this period, perhaps a point I should have made earlier, often we're not dealing with people talking in their own voice, we're dealing with people, other reports of them. And one of the most famous of these reporters, certainly for the mid-19th century, was Henry Mayhew, who was a journalist and social commentator. His 4-volume work, London Labour and the London Poor, is a very important source for kind of working class life at this time, and it takes the form as a series of it was originally newspaper articles, so it takes the form of a sort of a series of shorter articles, shorter stories, often describing a particular section of society, a particular place, a particular pastime. And here he's talking about costermongers. So costermongers were people that sold low-value items from a barrow, usually fruit and vegetables, but not exclusively so. And here we're talking, and here we get a sense that when they're between work, they like to gamble, and we get a real sense of that. I think at least we get a sense of perhaps Mayhew not fully understanding what's going on, putting a kind of a gloss of irresponsibility upon it. He talks about how they live to gamble for the whole week. Nothing will damp his ardour for gambling. The most continued ill fortune making him even more reckless than if he were the luckiest man alive. And all the while, the stake is the money he needs to buy his goods to make his living. But I think that it can be quite easily nuanced when, actually in the preceding paragraph, didn't include it for the sake of space, Mayhew talks about how this is mainly the young costermongers between 14 and 30, giving me the sense that this is really just a form of sociability, of a pastime. I'm sure the odd person got themselves into trouble, because people always do, but this is a way for people to sort of entertain themselves. And one imagines there is a sense of, and this is me speculating slightly, but one imagines there's a sense of sort of fraternity and things kind of usually working out okay in the end. Similarly, gambling appears in another of these sort of street reporters. This time, John Thompson in Street Life, London. I won't read the whole thing. Here he's talking about London nomads, talking about their difficult and perhaps not even financially wise lifestyle, but talking about how they continue to gamble fiercely despite being ill, despite having kind of their fortunes going up and down. It's sort of part of what they do, and we get this interesting sort of sense where this account is being told to John Thompson by a hawker, so effectively a costermonger, and how he offers to take them over to play dominoes with the London nomads, but he declines the offer because he wants to make sure he gets the story written down nicely. And up until now, our sort of commentators have been sort of associating, I think, associating gambling with a degree of kind of criminality, well, not criminality, a recklessness, and they're not the best moral character. But it's Gustave Doré in London: A Pilgrimage, in this print Thieves Gambling, which makes the most explicit connection between gambling and criminality, and this is part of his work, his 18th century work, London Pilgrimage, where he talks about the shadows and the sunlight of London, looking at both the highs and lows of life in the capital, and it's at this point that we will I'll just about get myself back on time and say that. There's lots more to explore in Dore and on this subject, and we will be doing so on the 7th of November in a talk, especially about Mayhew, Dore, and various other of these these commentators. But there's other talks obviously coming up well before that. So with a final apologies for the sort of slight mismanagement of the time there. I hope that was of interest to you. I hope that that both gave a sense of what the Victorians were really up to and how that kind of is played out in our collections that we have here. And at this point, I'll hand things over to you for questions, comments, and dare I say even corrections. But what we will do for that is you've just give us 1 minute to get ourselves straight. I'm going to hand this microphone round. This means that I'm going to hand this microphone round, and this means that the questions from the room will be audible to the people at home. So, does anyone have any questions? I'm just going to test this microphone. Nope, not working. It's on. Should be on. No, not working. I'll repeat the question. I think that life will make that a bit simpler. That microphone is not working, and I don't fancy troubleshooting that just now, so I will repeat the question, assuming indeed there are any questions from the audience. Oh, thank you very much, Esther. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much. I mean, after that, I'm not sure I want to solicit any more questions, but if there are any more questions or secretly or equally complimentary comments, they are welcome. But all joking aside, if there are no questions for now, we'll just check in with the people at home and see if there are any questions there. Sometimes there's a little bit of a delay. So not yet. No one's at home yet. So what I'll say just whilst we're waiting to see if there are questions from home is most of the material that we saw today can be accessed is on site here at the London Archives. The registers and workhouse records are either available to order up or through Ancestry, and many of the images as well are available through the London Picture Archive. So that's a source for you as well. And then in terms of events coming up, in September I will be taking a break from the presentations, but my colleague Jess and my colleague Rachel have various things organised as well. So we'll be looking at working widows in the 17th century London, and Rachel will be organising some talks and document viewings on the Victorian workhouse as well. And then in October we'll have some talks on the Magna Carta, and we'll be revisiting the Foundling collection, and then before we get to November, where we again pick up some of these themes around sort of Victorian journalism and sort of the Victorian observations of the working classes of their society. Were there any questions from home, Rachel?
Just compliments.
Okay, compliments are very welcome. I'm unusually anxious about this one, so I'm glad that it went down well. So if there are generally no questions, thank you all for coming. Thank you for your attention. I hope to see you again. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you here, and thank you to the people at home as well.